The arena dirt had long since settled in Colt Maverick's lungs, but the sound of 8 seconds still echoed in his dreams. He stood at the wooden fence of his modest ranch in Wyoming, watching the morning mist roll across pastures that had grown too quiet since his riding days ended. At 52, his left knee bore the scars of 1,000 bronc rides, and his shoulders carried the weight of glory that had slipped through his fingers like arena sand. The phone call came on a Tuesday that felt like any other. Ranger Delilah Westbrook from the Bureau of Land Management spoke in clipped official tones about a Mustang rescue operation gone sideways. "We've got a stallion, Colt. Beautiful animal, but he took a fall down a ravine during the roundup, shattered. His right foreleg. The vet says he'll never run wild again, might not even walk properly. We're looking at putting him down unless..." "Unless what?" Colt's voice carried the rasp of too many dusty arenas and late-night celebrations that had turned into regrets. "Unless someone with experience takes him, someone who understands broken things." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Colt's fingers traced the permanent bend in his own wrist, a souvenir from his last ride at the National Finals Rodeo 3 years ago. That night, he'd watched his championship dreams shatter along with his bones, his career ending not with applause, but with the hollow sound of an ambulance door slamming shut. "What's his name?" he asked, though he already knew his answer. "We've been calling him Storm, black as midnight with a white blaze down his face that looks like lightning." 2 days later, Colt watched as the horse trailer pulled up his gravel driveway. Storm emerged with a limp that mirrored Colt's own careful gait, his dark eyes wild with pain and mistrust. The stallion's right leg bore an external fixator, metal pins and rods that would be his permanent companion. But beneath the medical apparatus and the trauma, Colt saw something that made his chest tighten with recognition. The desperate pride of a champion who refused to believe his story was over. The first week was a dance of stubborn wills. Storm would stand at the far end of the pasture, watching Colt with the intensity of a predator, his magnificent head held high despite the obvious pain. Colt would sit on his porch with his morning coffee, studying the horse with equal intensity. 2 broken legends sizing each other up. "You think you're too proud to be helped," Colt murmured during one of their staring contests. "I used to think that too." The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked afternoon when Storm got spooked by thunder and tried to run. His damaged leg buckled, sending him crashing to the muddy ground. Colt moved faster than he had in years, ignoring the screaming protest from his own injuries as he reached the fallen stallion. He knelt in the mud, his hand hovering over Storm's trembling neck. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with understanding. "I know exactly how that feels." For the first time, Storm didn't pull away from his touch. The veterinary bills arrived like clockwork, each one a reminder that hope was an expensive commodity. Dr. Paisley Thornton made weekly visits to check Storm's progress, her weathered hands gentle as she examined the healing fracture. She'd been treating ranch animals longer than Colt had been riding, and her assessment was brutally honest. "The bone's healing, but it'll never be right," she told him after a particularly thorough examination. "He'll always have that limp. You're looking at a pasture pet at best." Colt nodded, but something in Storm's eyes told a different story. The stallion had begun following him around the property, maintaining a careful distance but always watching. There was intelligence there, and beneath the wariness something that looked suspiciously like curiosity. The real work began in the round pen Colt had built behind his barn. Not breaking. Storm was already broken in ways that mattered, but rebuilding, teaching both of them that movement didn't have to mean pain, that partnership was possible even when perfection wasn't. The first time Colt entered the pen with Storm, the horse's ears pinned back and he shifted his weight away from his injured leg. But he didn't flee. Instead, he stood his ground, nostrils flaring as he took in Colt's scent, his posture screaming challenge despite his physical limitations. "We're going to take this slow," Colt said, his voice steady and low. He'd learned patience the hard way, sitting in physical therapy sessions where every small victory was measured in degrees of motion rather than seconds on a clock. They started with groundwork, simple pressure and release exercises that asked nothing more than attention. Storm was brilliant, his responses quick and thoughtful once he understood what was being asked. The Mustang's wild intelligence had been shaped by survival, and he approached each new lesson with the focused intensity of an animal who had learned that adaptation meant life. Weeks turned into months. Colt's savings account dwindled as he invested in specialized equipment. A mounting block designed for his bad knee, therapeutic boots for Storm's leg, supplements and treatments that might ease their shared burden of damaged joints and disappointed dreams. His sister Quinn called weekly from Denver, her voice tight with worry. "You're pouring money into a lost cause," she said, during one particularly blunt conversation. "That horse will never be what he was, and neither will you. When are you going to accept that?" But acceptance, Colt was learning, came in different forms. On a crisp October morning, he managed to put a saddle on Storm for the first time. The stallion's body went rigid, muscles bunching beneath the leather, but he didn't explode. Instead, he turned his head to look at Colt with something that might have been trust. "That's right, boy," Colt murmured, his hand steady on Storm's. "Hey, we're not the same as we were, but maybe that doesn't mean we're finished." The first time Colt swung his leg over Storm's back, they both held their breath. The stallion's powerful body trembled beneath him, ready to react to pain or fear. But instead of bucking or bolting, Storm took a careful step forward, then another. His gait was uneven, compensating for the damaged leg, but there was purpose in his movement. They walked the perimeter of the pasture, two limping warriors finding their rhythm together. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't fast, but it was forward motion. Sometimes Colt realized that was enough to call it a victory. Spring brought unexpected visitors to Colt's ranch. Word had spread through the tight-knit western community about the broken-down rodeo star and his lame Mustang, and people began stopping by to see the unlikely pair for themselves. Most came expecting to witness a tragedy, but left with something else entirely. Harlan Pierce, a local horse trainer who'd known Colt since his competition days, pulled up the driveway on a warm April afternoon. He climbed out of his truck with the careful movements of a man who'd spent decades working with difficult horses, his eyes immediately finding Storm in the far pasture. "Heard you've been working with that BLM Mustang," Harlan said, his tone neutral but curious. "Folks are talking." "People always talk," Colt replied, but he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd grown protective of Storm, defensive about what others might see as futile effort. "Mind if I watch you work with him?" The question hung in the air like challenge. Colt had been avoiding audiences, afraid that outside eyes would confirm what his sister kept telling him, that he was chasing something that didn't exist. But something in Harlan's respectful tone made him nod. In the round pen, Storm responded to Colt's cues with an elegance that transcended his physical limitations. His damaged leg required accommodation, but his spirit remained unbroken. He moved with Colt like a dance partner who had learned to lead and follow simultaneously, their communication flowing through subtle shifts in weight and pressure. "Well, I'll be damned," Harlan muttered under his breath. After the session, as Storm cooled down in the shade, Harlan leaned against the fence with the expression of a man rethinking his assumptions. "You know about the therapeutic riding program starting up over in Jackson?" Colt shook his head. His world had grown small in recent years, focused inward on healing and survival. Woman named Juniper Caldwell is putting together something special. Working with veterans, kids with disabilities, folks who need a different kind of healing. She's looking for horses with the right temperament. Harlan paused, choosing his words carefully. Horses that understand what it means to overcome. The idea took root slowly, like spring grass pushing through the last patches of snow. Therapeutic riding. It wasn't the arena glory Colt had dreamed of, but it was purpose. It was a way for Storm's intelligence and gentle strength to matter. Again. Juniper Caldwell arrived the following week, a woman in her 30s with calloused hands and eyes that missed nothing. She watched Storm work with the quiet intensity of someone who understood horses at a level deeper than technique. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of certainty. "He's extraordinary," she said simply. "That horse has been through hell and come out the other side with his heart intact. That's exactly what my riders need to see. The first session was with Camden, a 12-year-old boy who'd lost his left leg in a farming accident 2 years earlier. He approached Storm with the careful wariness of someone who knew how quickly life could change, his prosthetic leg making small adjustments as he walked across the uneven ground. Storm seemed to sense the boy's vulnerability immediately. His usual alertness softened into something gentler, more patient. When Camden's mother helped him into the saddle, Storm stood perfectly still, his dark eyes focused on some middle distance, as if he understood the significance of the moment. They walked together around the arena, boy and horse both moving with adaptive grace. Camden's initial tension melted into wonder as he felt Storm's steady rhythm beneath him. The Mustang's gait adjusted to accommodate both their limitations. "He knows," Camden whispered, his voice filled with amazement. "He knows what it's like, watching." From the fence, Colt felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that glory might not always announce itself with crowds and trophy buckles. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the form of a boy finding his confidence again on the back of a horse who had refused to quit. By midsummer, Storm had become the heart of Juniper's therapeutic program. 3 days a week, the Mustang worked with riders who carried their own stories of adaptation and resilience, veterans missing limbs, children with cerebral palsy, adults recovering from strokes. Each found something different in Storm's patient strength. Colt discovered he had a gift for reading both horse and rider, understanding the delicate balance required when two vulnerable beings came together. He began assisting with sessions, his own experience with physical limitation, allowing him to spot potential problems before they became dangerous. "You're a natural teacher," Juniper told him, after a particularly successful session with Vera, an elderly woman rebuilding her confidence after a fall. "Have you ever considered getting certified as a therapeutic riding instructor?" The suggestion planted itself like a seed in drought-hardened ground. Colt had spent so many years defining himself by what he could no longer do that the possibility of new purpose felt almost foreign. But watching Storm work, seeing the Mustang's obvious pride in his job, made him wonder if reinvention was possible at any age. The certification program required travel to Colorado for intensive training. Colt hadn't been off the ranch for anything but medical appointments in over 2 years, and the thought of leaving Storm made his stomach clench with anxiety. But Juniper offered to care for the Mustang personally, and Storm seemed to sense that this separation was different from abandonment. The program was rigorous, combining equine psychology with human anatomy, therapy techniques with safety protocols. Colt's classmates were mostly younger, their energy infectious but sometimes exhausting. He struggled with the academic components, his hands better suited to reins than keyboards, but the practical applications came naturally. During a break, between sessions, he called to check on Storm. Juniper's voice carried a smile he could hear across the miles. "Your horse has been teaching my regular instructor a thing or two. Yesterday he figured out that little Marcus was having balance issues before anyone else noticed. Just started adjusting his gait automatically." The pride that swelled in Colt's chest was different from anything he'd felt in the arena. This wasn't about personal achievement, it was about partnership, about Storm's intelligence and compassion being recognized and valued. When Colt returned home, Storm greeted him with a soft nickering that sounded suspiciously like conversation. The Mustang had gained weight and muscle tone, his coat gleaming with health despite the permanent reminder of metal supports around his leg. More importantly, his eyes held a contentment that had been missing during his wild days. "We're going to make this official," Colt told him, running his hands through the stallion's mane. "You and me, we're going to help people find their way back to Brave." The paperwork to establish their own certified therapeutic riding program was daunting, but Colt attacked it with the same determination that had once driven him to climb back onto broncs that had thrown him. Insurance, liability waivers, safety protocols, facility inspections. Each requirement was another fence to clear. His sister Quinn surprised him by offering to help with the business side of things. She arrived from Denver with a laptop and a spreadsheet that made Colt's eyes water. but her presence was steady and supportive in ways he hadn't expected. "I still think you're crazy," she told him while reviewing insurance policies. "But you're crazy with purpose now. That's an improvement." The first official session of Maverick Mustang therapeutic riding was scheduled for a Tuesday in late August. 3 riders. Camden, now 13 and eager to continue his work with Storm, a young veteran named Cade who'd lost his sight to an IED, and Rosalie, a 5-year-old with spina bifida, whose parents had driven 3 hours for the opportunity. That morning, Colt stood in the arena with Storm, both of them carrying the weight of new responsibility. The Mustang seemed to understand that today was different, his attention focused and ready. "We've come a long way from that muddy pasture," Colt said quietly. "Think we're ready for this?" Storm's response was to lower his head and touch Colt's shoulder with his muzzle, a gesture of partnership that had developed over their months together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them the way they'd learned to do everything, together, one careful step at a time. Word spread through the valley like wildfire in dry grass. The retired rodeo star and his rescue Mustang were doing something remarkable, something that went beyond the usual expectations of horses and handlers. Families began calling from neighboring states, stories of need traveling ahead of them like prayers carried on mountain wind. The waiting list grew longer than Colt had ever imagined possible. Each name represented someone searching for what Storm had helped others find: the courage to trust their bodies again, the belief that limitations didn't mean endings. The responsibility felt enormous, but Storm seemed to thrive on the challenge. Dr. Thornton, the veterinarian who had once written Storm off as a pasture pet, became one of their most vocal advocates. During her routine visits, she would shake her head in amazement at the Mustang's condition and temperament. "I've never seen anything like it," she confided to Colt during a checkup that showed Storm's overall health continuing to improve despite his permanent limp. "That horse has found his calling. His stress indicators are lower than most perfectly healthy horses I treat." The breakthrough came with a new rider named Dashiell, a 19-year-old who had been paralyzed from the waist down in a diving accident. His anger was palpable, radiating from him like heat from sun-baked stone. He'd been through multiple therapy programs, each one failing to reach the rage that consumed him. Storm's reaction to Dashiell was immediate and unexpected. Instead of his usual patient gentleness, the Mustang showed a kind of respectful challenge, his posture straightening and his eyes bright with intelligence. It was as if he recognized a kindred spirit, someone whose pride had been shattered along with their body. The first session was a disaster. Dashiell's frustration boiled over when he couldn't complete a simple mounting exercise, his fists striking his useless legs as he cursed his new reality. Most horses would have spooked at the emotional outburst, but Storm simply stood steady, his ears forward with what looked like understanding. "He's not going anywhere," Colt said quietly, his voice cutting through Dashiell's fury. "He knows what it's like to have your body betray you." Something in those words penetrated Dashiell's anger. He looked up at Storm with new eyes, seeing, perhaps for the first time, the metal supports around the Mustang's leg, the careful way he positioned his weight to compensate for permanent damage. The second session went better. By the fourth, Dashiell was actually laughing as Storm responded to his commands with an almost cocky intelligence, the horse seeming to show off his ability to perform complex maneuvers despite his limitations. "He's a smartass just like me," Dashiell said, and Colt heard the first note of hope in the young man's voice. Media attention followed success. A reporter from the regional newspaper wrote a feature story that was picked up by national outlets. Suddenly, Colt found himself fielding calls from television producers and documentary filmmakers, all wanting to capture the story of the broken cowboy and his healing horse. Most of the attention he declined, protective of Storm's routine and the privacy of their riders. But he agreed to one interview with a magazine focused on adaptive sports, hoping it might reach others who needed to know that their stories weren't over. The photographer captured Storm in motion, his damaged leg, visible but not defining, his expression alert and proud. The image would later become iconic in the therapeutic riding community, a symbol of how limitations could be transformed into sources of strength. Financial support began arriving unexpectedly. Donations from readers who had been moved by their story, grants from foundations focused on veteran and disability services, corporate sponsorships from feed companies who wanted to be associated with their mission. For the first time since his retirement from Rodeo, Colt found himself able to plan for the future, instead of just surviving day to day. He used the funds to expand the program, building a second arena, and adding specialized equipment for riders with different needs. But the most important investment was in Storm's care. Advanced veterinary support, nutritional supplements, and massage therapy that kept the aging Mustang comfortable and strong. "You're not just a therapy horse anymore," Colt told Storm one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "You're the heart of something bigger than either of us ever imagined." Storm's response was to rest his head against Colt's shoulder, a gesture that had become their signature form of communication. In that moment, with the day settling into peace around them, both man and horse understood that they had found something worth more than any championship buckle. They had found a way to matter again. 5 years after Storm's arrival, the Maverick Mustang Therapeutic Riding Center had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking more than just horse therapy. They came for the story as much as the service, drawn by the legend of the Mustang who had refused to quit, and the cowboy who had learned that some victories were measured in hearts healed rather than seconds survived. Colt, now 57 with more silver in his hair but steadier purpose in his step, stood in the main arena watching Storm work with their newest challenge. A group of children from the local children's hospital, some fighting cancer, others recovering from traumatic injuries. The Mustang, now approaching 20 and showing his age in the careful way he moved, still possessed an uncanny ability to read each rider's needs. 8-year-old Bexley, bald from chemotherapy but fierce with determination, sat atop Storm with the concentration of a seasoned competitor. The Mustang sensed her fragility and moved with the gentleness of wind through grass, his gait so smooth she seemed to float rather than ride. "He knows she's sick," whispered her mother from the viewing, yet tears streaming down her face. "Look how careful he's being with her." Storm's reputation had spread far beyond Wyoming. Therapeutic riding instructors from across the country came to observe his techniques, trying to understand what made him so effective. Veterans Administration hospitals referred patients specifically to work with him. Research universities requested permission to study his methods. Dr. Millicent Rhodes from Colorado State University's equine therapy program had been documenting Storm's work for her doctoral dissertation. Her preliminary findings suggested that horses with their own trauma histories showed increased empathy and effectiveness in therapeutic settings, a theory that Storm seemed to embody perfectly. "He's rewriting what we think we know about animal-assisted therapy," she told Colt during one of her visits. "His success rates with PTSD patients are unprecedented, but for Colt, the statistics mattered less than individual moments, like watching Dishel, now 24 and working as a peer counselor, return for annual visits with Storm. The angry young man had become a confident adult who credited the Mustang with teaching him that adaptation was not the same as defeat. Or seeing Camden, now 17 and preparing for college, volunteer at the center every summer. The boy who had once been afraid to trust his prosthetic leg now moved with athletic confidence, his bond with Storm unbroken by years and growth. Storm himself had aged into distinguished elderhood. His black coat had silvered around the muzzle, and his movements carried the measured pace of wisdom rather than the quick reactions of youth. But his eyes remained bright with intelligence and purpose, and his connection with struggling riders seemed to deepen with each passing season. The recognition came unexpectedly, a letter from the American Horse Council nominating Storm for their annual award recognizing exceptional service horses. The ceremony would be held in Kentucky, a return to the heartland of American equine culture that felt both daunting and appropriate. "What do you think, old man?" Colt asked Storm, as they practiced loading into the custom trailer that had been donated for such occasions. Ready for one more adventure? The trip to Kentucky was a celebration of everything they had built together. Storm traveled like the seasoned professional he had become, alert and interested in his surroundings, but calm in his confidence. At the ceremony, surrounded by the finest horses in America, the scarred Mustang with the metal leg supports stood with quiet dignity as he received recognition for a career that had started in wild freedom and evolved into purposeful service. The standing ovation from the assembled horsemen and women was thunderous, a sound that reminded Colt of arena crowds, but felt different somehow, warmer and more meaningful. This applause was not for 8 seconds of violent grace, but for years of patient healing. In his acceptance speech, Colt found words he hadn't known he possessed. Storm taught me that sometimes the best thing you can do with your broken places is use them to help others find their way to whole. We came together as casualties, but we learned to be healers. That night in their hotel stable, Storm seemed to sense the significance of the day. He stood quietly as Colt brushed his coat, his breathing deep and content. At 20 years old, he had lived longer and more fully than most wild Mustangs ever dreamed possible. The return to Wyoming felt like coming home to purpose. Their calendar was booked months in advance, but Colt had learned to balance ambition with wisdom. Storm worked 3 days a week now, spending the rest of his time grazing in the mountain pastures, where he had first learned to trust again. On quiet evenings, Colt would often find himself sitting on the porch, where he had first watched the broken Mustang standing proud despite his pain. The years between that moment and this one felt both endless and instant, filled with small miracles that had accumulated into something resembling grace. Storm would wander over during these contemplative moments, his presence a comfortable weight against Colt's shoulder. Together, they would watch the sun set behind the mountains, two old warriors who had learned that the most important victories were often the quietest ones. Their story had become legend in the therapeutic riding community, proof that healing was possible at any age, and that broken things could become more beautiful for having been repaired. Visitors often asked Colt about the secret to their success, and his answer was always the same. We stopped trying to be what we used to be and started becoming what we were meant to be all along. In the gathering dusk, with Storm's breath warm against his cheek and the mountains standing eternal guard over their small piece of paradise, Colt Maverick knew that some journeys end exactly where they were supposed to begin, in a place where wounded hearts learn to beat strong again, and where the truest glory is found not in conquest, but in service. The Mustang had taught him that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand still and let someone else find their courage. In your calm, together they had written a new definition of winning, one measured not in seconds or scores, but in the sound of laughter from a child who had forgotten they could be fearless, and in the quiet pride of knowing that broken things, handled with care, often become the strongest of all.